Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're jumping into something pretty significant, really. It's about the recent events surrounding Operation Sindoor between India and Pakistan.
Right. Triggered, of course, by that very troubling Paris attack in Pahalgam back on April 22nd, the
Yeah.
one that specifically targeted Hindu men.
Exactly. And what we want to explore today is how Operation Sindoor seems to signal, well, maybe a real shift in India's military thinking towards Pakistan.
Yeah, it looks like a move away from responses that might have been seen as, let's say, symbolic, towards a strategy that's much more focused on directly imposing costs, making cross-border terrorism painful for those involved.
Absolutely. And we're basing our discussion today on an analysis from operationsindoor.pdf. It really lays out the sequence of events, digs into the strategic side of things.
And highlights this sort of evolving nature of India's reaction to terrorism coming from across the border.
So our aim here is to unpack what actually happened, explore why it might be so significant, this potential shift.
And think through what the consequences might be down the line. We want to give you a clear picture, without getting bogged down in jargon.
Okay, so let's kick things off at the beginning. The analysis really stresses that the Pahalgam attack on April 22nd was deliberately provocative.
It was the specific targeting, wasn't it, that immediately raised the temperature.
It did.
Yeah.
And led to those, initial reports of small arms fire across the line of control. Pretty standard, almost, in some ways.
But that targeting, as you said, it suggests it wasn't just random violence. It felt like an attempt to inflame things, maybe get a bigger reaction.
Which is precisely what happened next, right? India launched Operation Sindoor just after midnight, May 7th.
And the nature of that response, that's what's really key here. It wasn't just a small border skirmish.
No, the analysis points to the use of long-range standoff weapons. We're talking air-launched missiles, loitering munitions.
Which are basically those drones that can hang around, wait for the right moment, and then strike.
Right. And the significance of using these.
Well, it allows India to hit targets inside Pakistan, potentially quite deep, without putting its own pilots or troops directly in harm's way over contested territory. It reduces their risk significantly.
And the targets themselves. The analysis names 9 sites.
Yes, linked to Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, groups with a long, documented history of attacks against India. So it signals a very clear focus on hitting known terrorist infrastructure.
Okay, but this wasn't a one-sided affair. The analysis notes Pakistan's reaction. They claimed they shot down Indian aircraft.
Although it's worth saying those claims haven't been fully verified. It's often hard to get clarity in these situations.
True, but Pakistan did follow up with its own drone and missile attacks, framed as retaliation.
And that tit-for-tat exchange, using similar standoff weapons targeting military installations, that's a definite step up from how things might have played out in the past.
The analysis points to things really heating up around May 9th and 10th.
Yes, intense exchanges, with reports suggesting India carried out some pretty effective strikes against key Pakistan Air Force bases during that period.
And Pakistan launched its own counter, Operation Banyan Marsoos. But the analysis suggests it was, largely thwarted, didn't really achieve its aims.
It sounds like a really rapid, quite dangerous spiral of escalation over just a few days.
Exactly, and it was that speed, that intensity, that apparently prompted diplomatic intervention. The U.S., notably.
Leading to that ceasefire agreement on the afternoon of May 10th.
Which seems to be more or less holding, despite some minor reported violations.
Largely holding, yes. That seems to be the assessment.
Okay, so the immediate crisis cools down. Now, let's get into the core argument of the analysis. This idea that Operation Sindoor marks a real change in India's military strategy.
Yes, the shift from maybe issuing warnings or symbolic actions to actively imposing costs, to degrading the capacity of these groups to launch attacks.
That's the crux of it, isn't it? And if you look back, India's approach has been evolving.
Definitely. The analysis reminds us that before, say, 2016, there was a noticeable reluctance towards major military responses, even after huge provocations like the 2001 Parliament attack or Mumbai in 2008.
Then came Uri in 2016, and those special forces raids across the line of control. That felt different.
It did. A clear shift. A willingness to take direct, if limited, military action across the Laskan.
Followed by Balakot in 2019, the airstrike deep inside Pakistan. That crossed more thresholds, didn't it?
Absolutely, using air power, hitting a target in what was undisputed Pakistani territory, even if India framed it as counterterror. The tactical effects were debated, sure, but it set a precedent. validated that kind of force projection.
And Sindor, according to this analysis, takes it another step, a larger set of initial targets.
More force involved, yeah, and a wider variety of weapons, those cruise missiles, the loitering munitions we mentioned.
It really seems like a move towards relying much more heavily on these standoff capabilities launched from the air or the ground.
The analysis highlights India's investment here. Things like the BrahMos missile, Spice precision bomb kits, the Israeli Harop loitering munitions.
Plus the new Rafale jets with their Scalp missiles. And even the S-400 air defense system, which, while defensive, gives you more freedom to conduct offensive air operations.
It's a significant buildup of capability in this specific area.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Does this focus on standoff strikes change how India thinks about ground forces?
Well, the analysis raises that exact point. The cold start doctrine, that idea of rapid, shallow ground incursions by integrated battle groups, maybe that becomes less central.
Because these long-range weapons offer flexibility, reach, without the same risks as a ground invasion.
Potentially, yes. It could offer a different kind of strategic leverage compared to massing troops on the border. It certainly changes the strategic calculus.
Another point the analysis makes is about that cycle of counterattacks during Sindor. India initially said, this is measured, restrained, targeting terrorists, not the Pakistani military.
But then, unlike before, India released videos claiming successful strikes. And significantly, Pakistan admitted taking casualties.
Which probably created more pressure on Pakistan to hit back harder than they did after Balakot, right?
Exactly. That public confirmation on both sides likely fueled the escalation.
And led to that 4-day confrontation. More weapons, more targets on both sides. A noticeable increase in intensity compared to Balakot or Uri.
So if we're talking strategic significance, the analysis draws this line. Uri was about showing willingness to act. A symbol.
Balakot was demonstrating deep strike capability, crossing thresholds, proving they could do it.
But Sindor, the argument goes, was about inflicting actual material damage, hitting headquarters in places like Bahawalpur and Muridke.
Not just sending a message, but actually trying to degrade their ability to operate, hurt them operationally.
And then you have Prime Minister Modi's speech on May 12th. The analysis reads that as really cementing this shift.
Saying, essentially, military response is now the default. That nuclear threats won't deter India.
And explicitly linking the terrorists with their military backers? No distinction. Calling it a new benchmark, a new normal. That's strong language.
So let's dig into this logic of cost imposition. What's behind it?
The analysis suggests it's moving past the idea that just threatening Pakistan will change their behavior regarding these groups.
Like an acceptance that maybe Pakistan's fundamental intent isn't going to change easily, regardless of threats or diplomacy.
Precisely. So the focus shifts. If you can't easily change intent, you target capability. Make it harder, more costly for these groups to actually launch attacks by hitting their resources, their people, their infrastructure.
It's different from classic deterrence then, which is about preventing the attack in the first place through fear of retaliation.
It seems less focused on that traditional Cold War model, yes. The analysis argues that for parts of the Pakistani establishment and these groups, violence against India is almost foundational, part of their identity, not just a policy choice.
So expecting threats alone to stop it might be unrealistic.
Which leads to this idea of a strategy of attrition, accepting it's a long-term rivalry and aiming to make future attacks less frequent, less destructive by consistently hitting back and imposing costs.
The analysis calls this cumulative deterrence. Retaliation itself becomes the tool of coercion.
Yeah, trying to shape behavior over time through repeated costs rather than preventing action through a single massive threat.
It sounds in some ways like strategies other countries use. The analysis mentions Israel.
Yes, there's a comparison drawn to Israel's approach against groups like Hezbollah or Hamas, sometimes called mowing the grass.
Meaning?
Periodically degrading their military capabilities to keep them contained, prevent major escalations, but without expecting a final resolution, just managing the threat.
And the analysis notes the growing India-Israel strategic partnership. Could there be a transfer of ideas there?
It suggests it's a possibility, that these strategic concepts might be part of that partnership's dialogue. And Operation Sindor could be seen as India trying out this kind of cost imposition approach on a larger scale.
The initial strikes claimed over 100 terrorist casualties, though those figures are hard to verify independently.
True. But the strategic logic, according to the analysis, is less about the specific number and more about forcing these groups onto the defensive, making them spend time and resources rebuilding, hiding, protecting themselves.
Instead of planning new attacks, like the effect U.S. drone strikes had on al-Qaeda leadership, disrupting them constantly.
That's the analogy drawn, yes, keeping them focused on survival.
The analysis even floats the idea of this extending to peacetime actions, assassinations, support for groups like the Balochistan Liberation Army.
It mentions those as potential elements of a broader cost imposition strategy, yes, though those carry their own significant risks and complexities, of course.
Which brings us to the challenges. This more assertive stance isn't risk-free.
Far from it. The analysis points to a possible commitment trap for Modi. Having declared this strong policy, does it reduce India's flexibility in a future crisis, or maybe a different response is needed?
And there's the risk of giving the initiative to the terrorists, isn't there? If they calculate that provoking India leads to a conflict that serves their aims.
That's a definite concern. Plus, explicitly stating you'll target military backers alongside terrorists raises the stakes immediately in any future crisis. The escalation risk goes up significantly.
Although the analysis does note some restraint during Sindor itself. Avoiding mass civilian casualties, steering clear of nuclear sites, critical infrastructure.
Yes, there were apparent red lines. But where those lines will be drawn next time, under different pressures, is uncertain. And controlling escalation is always hard when you have imperfect information, misinformation, the fog of war.
Plus, the strategy depends heavily on good intelligence and tactics, right? To actually degrade capacity effectively, especially as adversaries adapt.
Absolutely. Tactical acumen becomes critical. And the analysis rightly stresses military action can't be the only tool.
You need the whole toolkit. Intelligence, diplomacy, financial tracking, maybe even things like leveraging the Indus Water Treaty.
Exactly. A comprehensive approach is essential. And managing public expectations at home is also key, avoiding getting pushed into purely military responses by public pressure.
And the analysis ends this section with a sobering thought. Cost imposition, on its own, is astrategic.
Meaning it doesn't solve the underlying political problem. It might contain the violence, manage the threat, but it doesn't lead to a lasting resolution. It demands constant effort and risk management.
Okay, but then the analysis takes a slightly different angle towards the end, presenting another perspective on Sindor's outcome.
Yes, it introduces the idea of it being a sensitive halt rather than just a ceasefire, emphasizing India feeling it was in control.
And framing it as a massive victory, going beyond just the initial aims.
Right. Claiming significant damage to infrastructure, demonstrating military superiority, restoring deterrence, and unveiling this new, more assertive doctrine. It's presented very positively.
Not symbolic, but decisive power, clearly applied. That's the phrasing used.
It goes back to the Pahalgam attack, the TRFLA claim, the alleged ISI backing, and contrasts India's past responses with this immediate, precise retaliation.
And it highlights Modi's doctrine again. No nuclear blackmail, direct strikes on havens, no terror and talks together.
Yes, framing that as the driving force. It even breaks down Sindor into phases. May 7th, precision strikes. May 8th, taking out Pakistani drones. May 9th, hitting air bases and UAV hubs. Then the May 10th, stoppage of firing.
And the claimed strategic effects are quite broad, enforcing a new red line, showing military dominance, restoring deterrence, asserting strategic independence.
And importantly, doing so without needing international mediation, which is framed as a sign of strength.
It's characterized as a limited war, right? Specific goals, not about occupation or regime change.
Exactly. Controlled escalation to achieve a political effect. India's restraint is presented not as weakness, but as maturity, maintaining escalation dominance.
So Sindor as a model, limited war, clear goals, adaptive execution, a contrast to forever wars.
That's the argument made, that the India of 2025 hits back immediately, precisely, unlike the India of, say, 2008.
And it signals India preparing for the next war with its doctrine, its defense industry, its military upgrades.
The halt is seen as just a pause. India holds the initiative, ready to strike again if provoked. It's portrayed as a modern conflict under a nuclear shadow, a case study for others facing similar threats.
So let's try and synthesize this, pull it together. Operation Sindor really does feel like more than just another incident.
It seems to signify a potentially major shift, yes. Moving toward this proactive cost imposition strategy, away from just reactive deterrence through threats. It definitely feels like a new phase in a very old, very complex rivalry.
A phase that carries potential benefits, perhaps, in degrading terrorist groups.
But also carries very real risks of faster, more dangerous escalation in the future. Its success really seems to depend on smart execution using all the tools available.
Not just military ones, and managing expectations, both at home and internationally.
And the big question hanging over all of this as India pursues this path is, can imposing costs consistently actually change the fundamental dynamics with Pakistan?
Or does it just lead to a new normal of more frequent, maybe more intense, but still ultimately contained cycles of conflict?
That's the uncertainty. It's a huge development for the region's stability and something we absolutely need to keep watching closely.